Join the revolution starting inside. An instrumental part of Agora worldwide. Agora worldwide. Agora worldwide. Counter economics. Agorist strip. Black market click. Move a quick flip. Can't regulate this. Agorist strip. Black market click. Move a quick flip. Can't regulate this. Agorist.
Agorist.
Agorist. Nexus. Agorist.
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 Brandon with the Agorist Nexus podcast. Everybody's been cheering me on lately, so let's go, Brandon.
Dude, that was going on for days before I bothered to figure out what that even meant, and then it was just fucking hilarious.
Somebody posted. I genuinely didn't know if it was fake or not, but somebody posted Facebook is banning people for posting "Let's go, Brandon," and it was fake. But I was for half a second, I'm like, I could believe that.
Totally believable.
we don't know. Is that fake? Yeah. But we've got a great guest. I forgot Dag. I've got my great coach Dag as always. What's up, Dag?
Yeah, I'm here, guys.
And then we've got a great guest, Magnus. How you doing, Magnus?
I'm doing okay, precisely okay. It's been a wild couple months, but we're keeping on. Keeping on. And I got to give a shout out to our sponsor, Presearch. Agorist Nexus wouldn't be nearly what it is today without their love and support. So Decentralized crypto search engine, earn crypto as you search, don't get spied on by Google, all that shit. So
moves, check them out.
Yeah, and click the affiliate link below. Seriously this time, so that they know that we're sponsoring. So the reason why I wanted to have Magnus on today was to talk about a couple different issues. In the Agorist community, it seems like there are a lot of mutualists and egoists, and I don't think there's really a better person to bring on to talk about this topic. So Magnus, if you could give us a rundown between the differences between what's the difference between like an anarcho-capitalist and a mutualist and anarcho-communist and all that, if you could.
Yeah, so mutualism and egoism both are very interesting because they're the only anarchist schools out of like 10 major ones now that are not prescriptive. They're just descriptive. They neither Proudhon, Tucker, or Stirner ever laid out like their dream society or how things should be. And like from a structural standpoint to where like ANCAPs are obviously very structural, and then ANCOMs, while not being as structural, still have like their basic rules against like private property and stuff like that of like, this is how the world will work. To where egoism and mutualism is more of a kind of ideological or moral view of the world. And that's what attracts me to it, just because I have this deep kind of inset belief that the idea that the entire planet would operate under one version of anarchy is kind of absurd. With all of our cultures and an entire planet, thousands upon thousands of miles of space and different environments and everything, like it wouldn't be a global Ancapistan or Ancom utopia or whatever. Like there'll be 100,000 different variations and stuff like that. And the key kind of differences between ANCAP and then like egoism and mutualism is mutualism and egoism kind of don't explicitly reject the NAP, but they just do not hold it in this extreme kind of monolith that the ANCAPs do. And they also have a very different take on private property, which is all like, as soon as people hear that, they start freaking out. But, that's why I double down. And again, I'm like, it's a moral thing. It's not, like private property is evil, thus, take everyone's private property, like the ANCAPs would say. Like Proudhon had this whole thing of going on this long-winded rant that no matter how much he criticizes the institutions that the capstone is private property, he never seeks to use force or the state or decree to ban people from possessing it or renting it or anything. It's just trying to push this more almost religious isn't the right word, but what moral code sort of viewing like people over property in that way is kind of where like the mutualists come from. And then the egoists come from it from like the kind of a totally different perspective of, their egoism is the most extreme form of individualist anarchy, to where essentially like, anything goes as long as I decide it goes kind of thing is the egoist sort of thing, like I will respect your private property unless, it means that I'm going to die or something like that. Then I don't give a shit, screw your private property. That's kind of how the egoists come at it from. So it's possible. There's a lot of people, myself included, that kind of draw still from like the free market and ANCAP side of things in mutualism. And there's also mutualists that are more socialistic. So it's weird in that way. And it's unique in that way to where it doesn't fit easily in a box as like ANCAPs or ANCOMs will, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I guess like my biggest issue, and I think you pretty much already brought it up with mutualism, is that they have kind of like this use it or lose it attitude. And I was like, well, how are you going to like enforce that? But you had already said like, wouldn't be like having the state or somebody else, but like how do you think that would happen if there was like some kind of mutualist society or everybody agreed to like that?
Right. So like there's something I say all the time and it makes people really mad on Twitter, but I genuinely believe it, that all genuine ANCAPs that don't have like some like horrific evil intentions in the world are technically mutualists, because what mutualism essentially advocates is very similar to like the Christian or Muslim idea of charity or anything like that. Of like, it's not that you shouldn't own two houses. It's that if you do own two houses and you see somebody who doesn't like have a place to stay or whatever, you should like morally, you should be like, hey, I have an extra house. That's kind of like the idea of usufructs and in-use property. When you look at it from, how Proudhon laid it out as a moralistic thing, it's not that the people come and take away your property that you're not using. It's that you morally shouldn't, hold on to things that you're not actively using for no reason when you see people in need. I always use the example of like almost anyone in the Midwest knows somebody who has a boat that's sat broken down in their yard for like, 30 years. And in the mutualist perspective, it's like, oh, hey, well, you're not using that. So would it hurt you to allow someone else to use that? And that's also why I kind of describe mutualists as like the annoying Jehovah's Witnesses. We're not going to come steal your property, but we'll knock on your door like every other week and be like, hey, you're not using that. Can someone else? Like that's kind of the idea behind it. At least like obviously you'll find mutualists who are very prescriptive in how the ideology works. And they're like, no, this has to be like moral law. And it's perfectly okay to seize someone's property if they're not using it. But that I don't know where that comes from, because everything Proudhon and Tucker wrote was like, yeah, don't do that, because that you just end up getting a state that way.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like, yeah,
it makes sense. I mean, if Tucker and them said no, before I get carried away with the questions, because I do that, let me get Dag in here. Do you have anything before Dag?
Yeah, so a couple things. I like that these like you say they're not prescriptive, because you can have like ideas along either egoism or the mutualism kind of thing and not be like contradictory to, let's say you are kind of like ANCAP-ish, like you pointed out, because ultimately, most of us believe in, well, property rights, and if there is some sort of government, it should be voluntary, right? So
right, and agorism is very similar to where I don't even technically consider it agorism of school of anarchy. It's more of a praxis and more of a way to like how to bring about anarchy or how to oppose the state.
Sure.
And it's very similar in that way to where you see like anarcho-socialists use agorism, but you also see ANCAPs use agorism. It's more this second layer to the ideology, and that's very similar with like egoism and mutualism.
Well, so one of the things that like even like attracts me like agorism is sort of the realization of like, you know, I mean, I know that this kind of what I'm about to say is come up recently, might be a little controversial among like some anarchists, but I'm not talking about that argument. But when I say like living in like reality, you know, ultimately the goal is like survival of like, you know, me, like that's like my goal is for like me to survive. And that's like the important thing. So I can, you know, I have theory and whatever in a way that I want to live life in a way that I feel is moral, you know, but ultimately the goal is survival, right? Like we do have to remember, okay, we're still just like monkeys on a rock that's like hurling through space, right? So like when we talk about things, you know, like, yeah, like laws of like non-aggression principle or whatever, it's like, well, that applies as much as the person standing across from you, like they feel it applies to them, right? And I kind of feel like that maybe is like the egoism like thing, like maybe I'm misreading it, but but you know, ultimately it's like things are about survival. So we could say, oh yeah, you know, non-aggression principle, I'd never steal, but I'm sorry, if you have like your son is like next to you and he's starving to death and your only option to feed him is to like steal food, like steal the fucking food for your kid, right?
Right. Yeah,
like,
that's I another post I made that really pissed off ANCAP Twitter, but I stand by it and I will post it again. Is like if you poke you know an ANCAP enough, you'll find out that they're either a mutualist or an egoist. And the examples that I use is like, well, if you own a piece of property and like in Ancapistan under like the idea of all, you know, contract laws and everything Rothbard kind of, well, not laws, but you get what I mean. Everything Rothbard put forward. If you owned a piece of property and then someone else bought all the property around you and then said you weren't allowed to trespass across their property, every single time I said that, they're like, well, yeah, I still believe in the nap, but like maybe like the people around him should like morally push him to like allow you to use a piece of his property to get out of your house. And it's like, okay, then you're a mutualist. And then on the other side of it, people will be like, well, screw you. I'm not going to stay here and starve. I'm going to cross your property. And I'm like, okay, cool. Then you're an egoist, you know, like, and it's like, yeah, that I feel like that's very human. And then people get really weird when I point that out. And it's like, it doesn't mean you have to totally throw away kind of your like ANCAP principles or whatever, but it's just an acknowledgement of like there's more to the human experience than contracts, and you know like
yeah.
There's more going on than just that.
Well, and the particular example that you gave, like, and I could be mistaken about this, but I think it's like old timey like Jewish like common law or something that addresses that exact thing. Like, no, you can't just block in somebody's land with your land. You have to give them a thing of egress. And of course, what enforces that? Whether or not people believe it and want to enforce it, you know, right? But yeah, it's sort of it does sort of take a little bit of the, you know, the real rigid theory into like, no, this is like reality and life, and this is how people have gotten along with each other for a long time. You know, I mean, ultimately, like me and my neighbors don't, you know, molest each other because it's illegal. It's because, you know, we look out for each other because that's just the kind of lifestyle that we want to have. You know, we never had a meeting to determine this. It just happens to be where I live. That's how we behave, you know?
Right.
So yeah, it's, you know, I like this kind of stuff because yeah, it really does keep us in reality a little bit. And then, one other thing that I wanted to touch on, and then, we'll get back to Brandon because I do have some other questions. We'll get to them later. But I just wanted to just, Tucker and, I always mispronounce it, but Proudhoon.
You got to put that French on it. Proudhon.
I'm bad at it. I'm actually like half French, but I never took French, so you know.
I apologize.
Yeah. hey, it's a whole story. They were Acadian. They fought the British. You know, they were badasses. But anyhow, but like I really like a lot of their stuff. And I was actually reading some Proudhon here before we started this podcast, and the only thing that like gets like my like, you know, ANCAP-y autisticness, like reading whenever I read them is, you know, like a lot of them are very like still labor theory of value-ish. And that sort of comes through in like some of their writings, even though I agree with, you know, the vast majority of stuff that they say, like some of just like the general like economics. Sometimes I'm like, but I have to like remind myself that it was kind of like before people really figured out like the value was a little more subjective, you know?
Right. And so, that's like the very important thing historically. This is one of my like topics I harp on the most with people. is that the world was a very, very different place like 150 years ago. And the language people use, how they describe things, was very different. I mean, we didn't have like a standardization of spelling and in the English language until very recently. And then you compound that with the fact that a lot of these authors were German or Russian or French. So it's like, okay, it's 150-year-old writing that got transferred from a foreign language into a language that hadn't even like hammered down the definitions of these terms, you know? So it's like people see certain things like property is theft and they get all weird, but it's like, okay, well, like Stirner's definition of property, Proudhon's definition of property, Adam Smith's definition of property, and Marx's definition of property are all different. And like we screwed up really bad as a civilization to not correct that issue, like, you know, 200 to 150 years ago. And it's only gotten worse to where now like people speak, you know, we're all speaking English, but we might as well be speaking two different languages because all of our words mean different things. Like capitalism and socialism are the biggest examples of that. You can ask
anyone a conversation about definitions before you can have your actual conversation, because otherwise you're not going to get anywhere. Yeah.
Yeah. You have to define your terms or you're going to get functionally nowhere. And then also like, this is something I brought up on a Pete Quintonia's show of like people's view of capitalism at that time, which again was a different definition. It was the capitalism as defined at that time for most people, you know, 150 years ago, was the state protection of businesses. So that's very different than what ANCAP would describe capitalism as now. But like I always bring up Voltairine de Cleyre did a book about the Mexican Revolution, and she pointed out that a third of the country was owned by one family, technically privately, even though it was through the state. And obviously you get through like all that weird stuff then. So when you look at a situation like that, where it was essentially these giant rural landlords in the actual definition of the term, like we have lords over the land that were doing all this awful shit in Europe and in Mexico and the United States. And well, not even in the United States. That's where the split comes from, is because the US was very different. And she goes into kind of that definition of why the European anarchists are so different than like the American, like Rothbardian anarchists, because we never went through that period of history of like, oh, well, literally all the land is owned by like barons and people that had bought this property and kicked the people out and everything. So their view of kind of that version of capitalism is very different than our view, because we as Americans never went through that. Like you could just keep going west, find a big space of property, you know, plant your flag in it and be like, this is mine now, to where that was something that Europe never got to experience. And that's why they view the world very differently. And, you know, like I said in the beginning of this, we never reconciled that difference of perspective or talk about it. So it just causes endless stupid debates over nothing.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah. Which also, like, that's why I recommend, like, my favorite anarchist of all time is Voltairine de Cleyre. And I think everybody should read her because she's like spectacular. And her criticisms of the United States post-revolution and her criticisms of anarchism in general are probably like the best I've seen anyone do. And she's so perfect, particularly for kind of my sphere of politics, which is this like anarcho unity, like kind of putting aside these divisions, to where all the way back in the late 1800s, she was like screaming at both the individualists and the collectivist anarchists, being like, hey guys, like, you have more in common than you think, like, shut up and quit fighting. You know, she was battling anarchist infighting all the way back then. So
hey guys, quick pause here to tell you about our sponsor, Devault Cryptocurrency. Ticker symbol DVT is a low cap coin with a market cap around 900,000. So there could be room for opportunity here. Not financial advice, but we really like this project.
Yeah, the Devault core wallet is one of the best I've ever seen. Very user friendly, super easy to use with cold staking rewards. So it's like getting interest. They're working on privacy with Terraform, also DeFi to decentralize and replace financial institutions.
So go ahead and check them out over at devault.cc and get you a Devault core wallet today. Also, be sure to check out the show notes to find exchanges that they are traded on. With that said, let's get back to the show. What you got, Brandon?
Cool, yeah. Actually, I want to hear more about Voltaire. If you could just go into like a brief.
Yeah, I'm actually not very familiar. So yeah, this is interesting to me.
Yeah, so she was born in Michigan in the 1800s, and she came up like she was like raised in like a convent and everything, like very different kind of experience. And then she kind of slipped into what was the sort of like budding Jewish anarchist movement in the United States, which is like the groundwork of where a lot of people like Rothbard and like more the individualist anarchists came out of. And she was very instrumental in kind of like she was around the same time as Goldman and everything like that, but she was very instrumental in sort of the anarchist without adjectives growing movements, because she, like me in a way, ran in all of these circles where she would be hanging out with a bunch of people that might be really big fans of Kropotkin, and then like the next day go to a convention of a bunch of Spooner people. And like, she was really engrossed in all of these ideas to the point where she was explicitly, like most anarchists at the time, like anti-theist, until she started hanging out with like Christian anarchists. And she even writes in her book of like, wow, that changed my perspective. I think it's perfectly fine to be a Christian and an anarchist. And like her most famous book, which is literally just Anarchism by Voltairine de Cleyre, is, you can look it up on YouTube. It's public domain. It's only about 45 minutes long, but she literally goes through every one of the 4 schools of anarchism, whether it's like there's the anarcho-capitalist side, the mutualist side, the anarcho-socialist, and the anarcho-communists. She very fairly and succinctly describes like where these ideologies come from, why people feel these ways, what ways are they valid, and which ways does she find criticisms of them. And she goes through all 4 of these schools, and then she finally gets to the end and she's like, well, I don't really like any of these, but all of these could be valid. And anarchism is all, supposed to be about the ability to try, or as she puts it, like the right to dare. And she just, lays it out beautifully at the end of like, hey, like, we'll figure it out. The world's more complicated than we think. It's a very colonialist thinking to apply one version of an ideology across the entire planet. There'll be thousands of variations of anarchism. The only thing that matters is the ability to try. And I'm like, that's beautiful. Like, that's perfect,
Yeah, I'm not sure, like, we have, I'm pretty sure we don't have, like, all the answers right now to solve every single problem, for sure. So, yeah, that just sounds super awesome. I'm surprised I haven't heard more about her.
I think she's in Michael Malice's book. I'm pretty sure he got some Voltairine in here.
Oh, in the Anarchist Handbook, really? Yeah. I haven't had a chance to check him out either. I've been working on several projects of my own, but page 205 for anyone who owns the book. You have Voltairine de Cleyre in there. Really great. Cool. Yeah.
Like I said, all of her stuff is public domain. You can listen to it in audio version on YouTube, and like she only has like 3 or 4 major works, but then tons of like essays and poems and stuff like that, and you can find all of it on the internet for free. So I definitely recommend people to check her out. She's kind of my like personal favorite anarchist out of all of them, just because she really embodied that whole "why the hell are we infighting" thing that I'm all about. So
yeah, you're like more for like coalitionism, right? Like
yeah,
I don't know if you've got more, Dag, but yeah.
Well, I guess while we're on that topic, like, yeah, I I definitely consider myself like an agorist, you know what I mean? But that's me, like that's like my thing, but like it really does bug me, yeah, the fucking like bickering amongst like anarchists and stuff like that, you know what I mean? Like I feel like those conversations are more like while we're having beers around a fire kind of thing, but it's like, the meat of it is like, do we hate the state? And I don't know, man, maybe it's just me too. Like I'm not a very like, not confrontational, that's not the right word, but like I don't like arguing with people about like silly stuff. So some of it just seems a little silly to me, but like I definitely jive with that. Like let's all do our things, you know what I mean? And we don't all have to agree that it's the best tactic, because we're never going to ultimately, and like you were kind of pointing out, there's going to be there's going to be different communities, there's going to be different societies, there's going to be different ways that different things are run, in different parts of the world. Like, okay, so like for instance, like I'm a staunch anti-prohibitionalist, right? But there's some parts of the world where enough people don't like booze or don't want booze around that it's like, I don't know, man. Like, who am I to go in there and say, no, you are all evil and you need to let people sell booze in the corner store? Like, it's just like, that's just not my place,
Right. I always use the example of like if we just snapped our fingers and all the governments in the world disappeared tomorrow, like what right does the ANCOM have to go out to like rural middle of goddamn nowhere Montana and walk up to a guy and be like, hey, you don't own that farm? Like, no, like, but at the same time, what right does like a Western, like, white dude have the right to go to Africa and be like, hey, you guys can't communalize and like reject private property? Like, what right do I have to go to these people and tell them like how they're supposed to do their anarchism?
Yeah,
and obviously
exactly.
there'll be friction points, there'll be confrontation, there'll be clashes in ideology and what's supposed to be right or wrong, but that happens now.
Yeah, we're humans. I mean, it's always going to happen.
Yeah. So the famous popular quote of anarchism is not a promise that people won't lie, rape, and steal. It's just, the state is a promise that someone will. So I think a lot of people have these utopian ideas. I find it more on the left, but you do find it on the right as well, of like, oh, once we get this, like everything will just be perfect. And it's like, no, we're still people. Like, yes, a lot of our negative behaviors and the way we act is a product of the state and of the current society that's built off the state, but it's not going to all go away. So we're going to have to deal with that forever.
Right. Like we can certainly blame a lot of stuff on, public schooling and Federal Reserve and this and that. But something that like I've been reading a little bit about lately is, like I'm really starting like just how much of humans' desire to be ruled, is taught to them or, taught into them versus, do people really generally desire freedom? Do people really want it? There's some, psychologists or whatever who make the case that people don't, want freedom. I don't know if that's true or not, but, with a lot of the shit that I've been seeing, especially, the last year and a half, it's like, man, I really got to ask myself, like, do enough people want it, or is it just going to be pockets? Like Honkin talks about, like there'll be pockets of statism and pockets of, like agorist societies or what have you, and I just have a hard time believing that there's ever going to be, freedom across the whole world,
Yeah. And I mean, that's the thing too, is even, like I said, even if I snap my fingers and all the government goes away, like there's going to be areas where people reform the government. Like
instantly.
That's just a reality. And again, like, as long as as an anarchist, I believe there probably always will be, but as long as there isn't like gross oversteps of rights and freedom, like, I live in Michigan, just use these examples. Like if Detroit becomes an anarchist commune and then like Kalamazoo, which is on the other side of the state, immediately reforms a government and everyone there is like, well, we want a government. Like what the hell right do I in Detroit have to go over there and be like, no, you're not allowed to have, like, a lot of people joke of mandatory anarchism, which is, when you say it like that, it's fucking hilarious because you realize how stupid that is. But there is a lot of people that genuinely feel that way of like, we must have revolutions all across the planet constantly until there's no government anywhere. And it's like, okay, that's kind of contradictory to the point,
It's not how I want to live my life.
Right. And that's another thing I really like about Stirner, because he is like you do not get more individualist than Stirner, period. I don't think you can go any further down that rabbit hole than him. And his whole thing this inspires people. Like I can tell Michael Nellis really likes Stirner. And I know he even said that he has a signed first edition copy of one of his books or something. But the Stirner very, principled idea was to stop worrying about mass movement anarchism and to just live as free as possible and free yourself to hell with the consequences. And if that inspires other people, cool, but stop waiting around for other people to realize, their slavery and free themselves.
Yeah, I think on that. Yeah.
Yeah. I think a lot of anarchists, once again, a lot on the left, but also, plenty on the right are like, well, I can't be an anarchist until everyone's an anarchist. And it's like, well, that's kind of stupid. That's never going to happen. So, start, taking your freedom now and freeing yourself as far as like the Stirner quote is free yourself as much as you can and as far as you can, and you have done enough. And that's kind of how I feel, because a lot of people kind of try to paint me as some mass movement anarchist, and I'm like, no, like I'm already my life's already kind of wild and screwed because I've decided to live this way now. And if anyone else wants to follow me, cool, but I don't really need to explain myself or debate you or change your mind. I'm just going to keep doing my thing and you can figure it out on your own time.
Yeah, man, that's a beautiful way of doing it. That's how I try to live my life too. I try to just live as freely as possible in the kind of circumstances that we're in now. So for sure. Man, you've given us such good content. Is there anything that you wanted to cover before we've just kind of been hammering questions at you.
I know. I feel like I go in 5 different directions, and this could get a little spidery. So I don't.
Yeah, which direction do you want to go in?
That's fine. I love spidery conversations, but definitely just kind of the one thing I do like to bring up people, because this is my kind of whole shtick, so I feel obligated to bring it up. But I find it a lot in, like, you know, the ANCAP and the libertarian circles and stuff like that, of people calling themselves individualists but thinking in an extraordinarily collectivist way, and it causes so many problems to me, and it seems so self-destructive and pointless. And what I mean by that is the current example of, like, the vax mandates, for example. A lot of people I just see constantly are like, well, the left are doing this. This is the left. We need to completely reject the left. This is all the left doing it and all that. But then I go on my timeline and you have, like, Caitlin Johnstone, who has 1 million followers. She's an explicit communist. She's out against the vax mandates. You have people like Samira Khan. You have people like Jimmy Dore. You have people like Max Blumenthal, like all these huge names on the left that have planted their flag against the vax mandates. And it's like, and, you know, I say, like, hey, you know, you should unite with these people. And I'll get a lot of, like, Hoppian types or, you know, like extreme libertarians or paleos be like, no, I can never unite with the left on anything. And it's like, okay, that sounds pretty communist to me. Like, I don't, like, I might be wrong, but, like, you're literally saying, like, oh, this person is part of this nebulous idea, you know, blob of collectivism where they've rejected their individuality, but you're calling yourself an individualist. You're saying that you view every person as an individual that's unique in their own way. So how could you reduce all these other people into groups and then pretend to be an individualist? Like, oh, I'm the only true individualist. Everyone else are faceless blobs that are copy pasted. And it's like, I don't get that. And I call people out on the right about that, like, all the time, of, like, you say that you're an individualist, but you dehumanize literally everyone else. And that's your biggest criticism of collectivism, is it dehumanizes people. So do you not see the contradiction, like, inherently there?
All right, let's take a quick second to shout out Agorist Acres seeds. AgoristAcres.com stocks a variety of seeds for your garden or homestead. They also have really cool packaging instead of those silly paper envelopes.
Buy seeds with crypto, support the counter economy, and become self-sustaining today. Agorist Acres offers fast shipping, so you can get started right away.
Make sure you use code Nexus10 at the checkout for 10% off of your orders. Also, they will donate a portion of the sale to Agorist Nexus, helping to bring you all the great content you expect. And all right, let's get on with it. Like, what? So give me, like, an example. Like, when you say, like, they like collectivize as a group. Like, are you saying it's like, oh, my net taxpayers, or like, what kind of example do you have for that?
Well, the biggest example I went through the most is with, like, BLM, of like I marched with a lot of, like, people that identified with that label, and they were all very, very different types of people, very, very different politics or anything like that. But then when someone would come to criticize me from the right, they'd be like, oh, you were marching with that, like, DNC communist, like, you know, neo-Marxist organization. And I'm like, the people I marched with were, like, a bunch of anarchists, and they, like, hated the DNC and stuff. So, like, it's just looking like another good example would be, like, pronouns in the bio or something like that. Like, that doesn't say nearly as much about someone's personality as people on the right might pretend it does, but, like, they'll dehumanize them into this bubble of, like, oh, well, you did this one thing, or you hold this one belief, so I can assume all of your other politics and then put you in a box and then dehumanize you and ignore you and reject you and refuse to work with you because of this one thing. And I'm like, that sounds just like the same idiotic cancel culture shit that we deal with from people on the left, but just in a different direction, you know?
Well, yeah, and I mean, if nothing else, like, you know, it's the kind of thing where you at least, like, you know, if you just listen to people who you totally agree with, you don't grow, you know, you don't learn. So even like if you read a book by somebody who doesn't have the same, you know, opinions as you, it's going to affect your, you know, just your view of the world, and most likely in a more positive way, because you're going to understand it better by understanding where other people are coming from. So, so if nothing else, you know, it's like, man, just being open to having conversations with people, you know, it doesn't mean that you have to be on their side, you know, either, you
right.
know, so
and
it's, it's just how you learn.
And like, you might be surprised. Like, that's the thing of like, I've caused, you know, I'm very against bragging about myself because like low self-esteem or something like that. But the one thing I can directly contribute to myself, and I'm very proud of, is I've caused a lot of cross-pollination from the left and the right. And I've had a lot of people sit down from the left and the right and actually have like conversations with each other for the first time, and then be like, whoa, actually we agree on like way more than we disagree on. This is weird. And it's like, yeah, because like how someone feels about, like, you know, you can say their beliefs are contradictory. Hell, even I say their beliefs are contradictory, but you might see somebody who's like, you know, marching for Medicare for all or whatever, and you can be like, well, that's dumb. But then you could talk to them like a second later and find out there's like, they are a extremely devoted free speech activist, and they also dramatically support the Second Amendment. And it's like, whoa, you know, if you would have just stopped at the Medicare for all thing and be like, oh, this is just some idiotic Bernie Sanders socialist commie, whatever, they're stupid, then you would have never got to those parts where it's like, oh, we actually like agree on all of this stuff. And that's kind of the experiences I've had, to where I see like people from Fred Hampton leftists, which is like an explicit, like, you know, Black revolutionary communist kind of group, like commenting on like Phil from All That Remains posts, who's like a libertarian. And like, that's because of the conversations that I've gone to people and they're like, hey, you know, let's humanize each other and let's have conversations, and like not even debates. Cause I feel like that's the first step people go to, of like, oh, listen to people that disagree with you and then have conversations. What they mean is what we've had for the last 5 years, where you get on YouTube and you have a giant shit fight and calling each other idiots and trying to break down each other's ideas and convert each other. And I'm saying reject like the convert. Like, the whole thing I do on my podcast is I take someone from the left, take someone from the right, and force them to agree with each other for an hour. And beautiful, like, productive things come out of that. And I feel like that's kind of like where I believe things need to go, is my, you know, being an extremist individualist like I am, is pushing that, like, okay, talk to each other like people and find where you agree, instead of trying to break each other down or convert someone into your ideology or whatever. Just find your common ground and build from there.
Yeah, and I mean, there's obviously, you know, we all want to convert somebody one way or another, but I mean, like, the, you know, like I feel like the best way to do that is, yeah, get along with people and lead by example. You know what I mean? If what's working for you works, you know, you can share that, and maybe other people will, you know, want to emulate it, you know. But ultimately, man, I mean, if you can have a positive transaction or interaction with somebody, like, you know, only so much else really matters. You know, if we're gonna either do business together or be neighbors or whatever, you know, just the fact that the business transaction goes well, or the fact that the neighborly relationship goes well, is really the most important thing. You know, now, you know, again, there's always something to be said for planting a seed here or there, but yeah, just being silly or feuding with somebody just doesn't get anybody anywhere.
Right. Yeah. And that, I do think it's just, you know, it gets to the point almost where I think some of the bigger movers and shakers are aware that, like, people are coming together on issues, so they're deliberately trying to keep people separated. Like, I had this whole post last night where I almost feel like a lot of people on the right that exclusively blame the lockdowns on the left, but then you poke them and you're like, oh, well, yeah, Jimmy Dore's good. You're like, oh, okay, like the Fred Hampton leftist people are good. Max Blumenthal is good. You know, Samira Khan and all these people are good. It's like, okay, you just described like over like a quarter of the left. You know, so it's like, do you think it's worth, at least, like, if you're going to still be like, well, the left is pushing lockdowns, you at least think it would be worth, you know, adding in a second sentence to be like that, and be like, even though the left is like pushing lockdowns, there's a bunch of like prominent people that are fighting against it, but they don't acknowledge that. And that causes people to assume like one side of the politics' entire belief on things, and then like deny themselves allies in certain fights completely. you kind of saw this happen to the libertarians and like the ANCAPs and everything like 10 years ago, where there seemed to be a really good pressure campaign to sell like the fight for marijuana legalization as exclusively a left thing. So if you ever talk to somebody and you're like, yeah, you know, I'm a free market guy, like I'm more on the right, people would just assume that you're for, you know, drug criminalization. And they never acknowledge the libertarians. They never acknowledge the people like Ron Paul and stuff like that. They keep them in a box, and that spreads division, and that makes people assume the politics of other people without ever having a conversation. And I think that's been the most effective tool of the state lately, and why things are so divided, because you can see one thing in someone's Twitter bio and make up this imaginary person of their position on every single issue without ever having a conversation with them.
Well, it's like really the problem with like having like such like rigid like categories in the first place, because like you mentioned earlier about like, you know, just because somebody is, you know, wearing a Black Lives Matter t-shirt doesn't mean that they're you know, because the people who run it might be Marxist or evil or, you know, what the fuck ever. It doesn't mean that that person, you know, has anything to do with them at all. And so that can go along the lines of anything, you know, a political group, or I mean any of the examples you pointed out, you know, where it's just so easy to paint somebody with, and I mean I'm very guilty of it myself. I mean, I got to catch myself all the time, you know, just something like, you know, like you said with like, you know, pronouns in the bio. It's really like, you know, who the fuck is this, you know? And some of that's where I live, and like I don't live in LA, like that's not common, you know, to have your pronouns in the bio amongst like people I know. And it doesn't mean that I'm, you know, against anybody who has an alternative, what have you, but like, you know, it's just, you know, I just got to catch myself with all sorts of stuff like that too, because it's so easy to just categorize people. And especially when you start talking about, yeah, like the left or Democrats or something, it's so easy to get mad at them for whatever, when I don't care for the mainstream right anymore than I do the left, you know, but
right.
It's easy to do. So it's definitely something that we, you know, we have to watch ourselves on.
Absolutely. That's just the main, you know, talking to people and figuring out how they believe on things is just so important. Like, to continue on the pronoun of the bio thing, like one of my best friends on you know the internet and everything like that is a woman named Ashley. She's a male to female trans person, and if you clicked on her bio, you would just see like pronouns and like you know her meme that she has in her thing, and that's it. And you'd be like, oh, this is some California lefty blah blah blah. But then like the most recent thing she posted today was like, hey, I just got like 2 AR-15s and a pistol, and she has a trans don't tread on me flag. And it's like, okay, put that person in a box. I dare you, you know?
Hell yeah.
like try to, you know, shoehorn Ashley into a neat little political, like, you know, thing to make you feel comfortable. You can't. And it's the same thing with me, and it's the same thing with a lot of like ANCAPs and a lot of ANCOMs and a lot of, you know, especially with like the BLM movement of like, I predominantly ran around Louisville, where they were an explicitly unity message. They had like 3%ers march with them and shit. They were explicitly anti-DNC, and they were explicitly pro-Second Amendment. So it's like, okay, you know, take that BLM organization and put it in the same box as like the Washington, D.C. one. Like try, you know? And the more you do that, the more you realize like, oh, all these collectivist labels and all these like organizations and all of these teams and everything are bullshit. So, you know, I agree with you that you even I, you know, this is my message. This is what I preach constantly. I catch myself collectivizing people. But as long as you're like aware of that, as long as you have that moment of like, maybe I'm jumping to conclusions here, that's the start. I mean, I saw another interaction the other day where there was another person, they had Bernie, like, you know, hashtag Bernie Sanders 2024 in their bio, BLM, they had trans pride flag in their everything. And they were debating with some of my friends, and my friends were all kind of jumping to conclusions about their politics. And one of them was like, oh yeah, you know, if you think unarmed people getting killed by the police is wrong, then how do you feel about Ashley Babbitt? Because that's kind of a gotcha. Like, oh, you know, they were Trump supporters, so they deserve to die, is what the person assumed they were going to say. And this Bernie Sanders BLM leftist person was like, yeah, it was a tragedy, and no one that's unarmed deserves to be shot, and that was wrong. And all my friends were like, whoa. And it's like, and I literally immediately jumped into that. I'm like, this is why you don't assume people's politics. You know, you never know how someone's going to feel about something just because of whatever, you know, NASCAR sponsorship labels they stick to themselves.
Oh shit. I have this has been great, by the way, but I have a couple of things on mutualism and or egoism. Did you want to talk about anything before we moved on, Brandon?
No, I wanted to hit that too, but I'll let you. I'll let you get back to it. I'll let you start it.
Here's a question. And let's say that I understand the difference between, like, let's say what we think legally should be the case and what morally should be the case. But I have a couple questions. One, are mutualists, are they the rent is theft crowd, or are they like rent is theft adjacent, or what's going on there?
We definitely fall into the rent is theft crowd for sure.
Okay. So because I find like no like moral issue with, let's say, like having, like a second house that you maintain and like rent out. And I just from like, because there's reasons where like somebody maybe doesn't want to own a house. Like maybe they just need to live somewhere for a couple months, et cetera, et cetera. So like in that kind of circumstances, do you feel that that's like, I don't know if immoral is the right word, but what's your thoughts on just something like that? And okay. So before you answer, the example you gave before of Mexico, or like one family owning a third of the country, like obviously that is insanely, like that's a ton of, like imbalance, or just a ton of land. So like that, obviously, like there's some, like, I don't think somebody can own that much land without some sort of state interference or blah, blah, blah. That's obviously, right. There's a lot of things wrong with it. But like, let's say I just have a second house that I bought, fixed up, paid for. I bought another one next door and I'm renting out the other one. Is there something morally wrong with that? Or what are your thoughts?
Yeah. So definitely, like even back when Proudhon, a self-labeled socialist, said that, he was very explicit that it was kind of like more of a shock term to kind of start a conversation. It's very much the case today, to where there's kind of no hard and fast lines about it. But the whole kind of thrust of modern mutualism, at least in like the, now in our current day, is a view of an issue that we find with anarcho-capitalism that is very different than the ANCOMs, because like I still explicitly believe in the free market 100%, like laissez-faire and Capithan as much as possible when it comes to the market. But the issue that we see is on the topic of land, because when you look at all of the economic arguments of like, monopolies are not going to form because there will be competition. So even without taxes, you're not going to have monopolies. You don't need regulation because competition will destroy bad actors. Like I agree with all of that. But when it comes to land, without taxation, without a government or whatever, there is no negative cost to hoarding land. If you can afford land and buy land, then you don't need to maintain it. There's no upkeep for it. So you can own as much as you possibly want for no reason. Like you could literally just be a conservationist and buy, hundreds of thousands of acres of property, put a fence around it, say if you're on here, you're trespassing, and you're never going to, there's no upkeep required. You're not losing anything. The laws of competition in the free market kind of stop there, because how are you going to compete with me not using the land that I'm going to use for whatever the fuck I want? And even an ANCAP will argue that of like, maybe I bought this lake because I like this lake and I don't want it to be like ruined or anything like that. So, go to hell. It's my lake. It's kind of hard to argue against that, So that you run into issues there of the ANCOMs like to make the argument of like essentially ANCAPs would be recreating feudalism. And I don't go that far, but I do think it lands on like an argument of like, there has to be some kind of address for the concept of somebody hoarding land, hoarding property, and buying stuff up and making it to where a person has no freedom of movement, of where someone doesn't have an opportunity to purchase shelter, housing, or anything for themselves, and they're just fucked. Like, how do we address that?
Sure.
And obviously the ANCOMs come at that of like, well, abolish private property. And I'm like, no, but that's where the mutualists come in of like, hey, we do morally view it wrong to essentially develop property only for the sake of like making someone else pay to live on it. We view it similar to taxation, but it's because it's a moral thing. It's very different. So we're like, okay, you own a house in Montana or something like that, and you also own like beachfront property in Florida. It's a little fishing shack or something like that. Nothing big, like one story. It's nice, whatever. You rent it out from time to time. It's like, I don't morally view that wrong. I don't morally view it wrong if you owned 3 properties like that. Mm-hmm. But the thing we try to address is what we have now, to where you have like slumlords that own like hundreds and hundreds of properties. They don't maintain them. They don't give a fuck about them. And they essentially manipulate housing markets and do a bunch of like devious shit on the side. And yeah, there is a lot of state interference with that. but it's just something that I don't view as completely going away in kind of an anarchist society. So that's kind of like the moral thing of like, it's never supposed to be targeted against the small landlord. At least me, it's different depending on some, like I said, some mutualists are more socialistic and they will be like,
yeah, I've definitely heard straight up. Yeah. Like any rent is theft kind of thing. And I'm like, but like maybe it's convenient and everybody's agreeing. Like, come on. You know?
Right. Yeah, exactly. But yeah, it's just, you know, built to address that kind of like, monopoly is not the right word because I do believe monopoly is purely a manufacture of the state. But it is kind of to address like the possibility of like company town bullshit or anything else that we kind of experience with. And I don't think that would be as bad as in a stateless society as it was in, you know, being supported by the state. But just like moralistically, even if I was a pure ANCAP and we were in Ancapistan, if I went to a town and it's like, welcome to Johntown, everything's owned by John. If you don't do what John says on here, go to hell. And if you try to like walk down my street or something like that, like go fuck yourself. It's like, okay, hold up. You know, like there might not be anything like legally, morally, if that makes sense. Like I should take direct action against you. But like in my heart, I'm like, okay, this is kind of fucked up. And that's how I come at it, you know?
Sure. Cause like we definitely recognize the difference between just like obviously there's things like, because we all have our own different personal limits too. Like I don't necessarily have a problem with like a pharmacist selling like heroin or something, right? I'd probably prefer they do it. It's pure and clean, but like I couldn't sell heroin, you know, just morally, I couldn't sleep at night, you know, that kind of thing. Man, that was okay. So okay. Everything's about rent, everything. I totally get all that. And I'm not on board.
Yeah.
Okay.
And that's just, it's just kind of, and yeah, it's just kind of belief of like, even if everyone stays at ANCAP, the more people personally hold, like you said, like I personally won't hold heroin, the more people that personally believe like, yeah, I don't want to own a bunch of property and be an evil bastard about it, the less likely that even in a pure Ancapistan stuff, something like that would happen.
Well,
you know?
It's funny because like I see, and like again, I don't disagree with anything you said, but like I'm an environmentalist, right? And that was one of the big challenges for me, even becoming like an anarchist. That was one of the last things for me to let go of was like, well, what about the environment? You know what I mean? Like, because if there was no, well, you know, it just run wild and everything would be destroyed and blah, blah, blah. And, you know, I read a lot about that. And that's actually like sort of turned me right now. I'm like, okay, I don't want the state to help with the environment because they fuck it up, you know?
Right. Yeah. But Bookchin's really good about that. Murray Bookchin is an awesome environmentalist.
I don't think I'm familiar with them. I'll check them out. I read a lot of Anderson and Leal, envirocapitalists and free market environmentalism. And I also follow a lot of stuff that the Nature Conservancy does. And I love that as an example. I actually give them money. They do some stuff that's like, you know, politics, but not like the Sierra Club does. It's like all politics. But like what they do is like they take their money and they buy, you know, lots of land so that it can be preserved. But they do a lot of really cool things that, you know, government state parks don't typically do because, you know, they suck. But like, you know, like they allow oil drilling on their property, but it's written in the contract that they have to do all this extra work to clean it up like it was never there. And, you know, they do that. Sometimes they'll have land and they'll sell it, you know, in order to, because it's worth a lot of money. So, and yeah, it might end up being developed or whatever. But that amount of money, it enables them to buy more land. So they make like business, like, you know, market decisions as to how they do like conservation. And like, I think that's, you know, that's really cool. But I guess the point that I'm getting at is like, if somebody was like holding a lot of land, and again, a third of a country is just insane, right? But like, if somebody was holding a lot of land, what I feel would be a cost to them, even if there weren't taxes, were like, there's opportunity costs of them not selling it, not renting it out, not doing whatever. So not to say that it isn't possible, but like just my capitalist brain is like, somebody's going to do something with it. And I just use these examples of like free market environmentalist solutions that a lot of people have come up with. Because I just feel like, because my thing is, I'm like, man, like if just everywhere's just developed like black bears and shit, like, you know, we have problems in Florida with them not being able to get around and migrate. So it's like, my solution is people buying the land privately to keep it from necessarily being developed. But again, without the state, I feel like there's the market forces that make it more fair.
Right.
You get what I'm saying? Which I'm sure you don't necessarily disagree with that, but I'm a nerd about that kind of shit. So I had to get that.
No, yeah, and that's definitely 100% true. Like I do feel you do have those people that are just like the opportunity cost is a very subjective thing to where like the one example I use is the CEO of Epic Games, which is the people who made Fortnite, bought like 1 million acres of forest or something like that and put it up for conservation. And it's like in that instance, as an environmentalist, I'm like, okay, that's awesome. That's literally like, the free market at work. That's the market protecting, everything. That's awesome. But then I think about that. I'm like, okay, what if this was like a crazy religious zealot that was like, okay, this is my holy land. I'm going to buy all of this and I'm going to pay a helicopter to drive around, and under my ANCAP kind of belief, if you step foot on this property, I'm going to shoot you because you're trespassing. And it's like, okay, you could argue that that's within their like rights of property or whatever, but moralistically, I would sit there and be like, okay, that's kind of bullshit, and that's just how that's how I come at it from my mutualist perspective of, if I always describe the difference of like, you have your structural anarchy, which is like the law, like, not actually, but like, you get what I mean. And then there's your moral anarchism, which is like your religion. And like, I definitely come at, hello. Oops, sorry, somebody showed up. Hello. Good. Exactly. Yeah. I'm Adam. Chelsea. Hi. You can talk to me a couple minutes. Yeah, I'm on a podcast right now. The Department of Justice just showed up to my house. 1 second.
Oh, Jesus.
Oh shit.
Hey, yeah, I have feds at my house, so I'm gonna have to cut this short, guys.
Hey, okay. Yeah, man. Hope everything's all right, dude.
Yeah. Hope everything goes good.
Get with us. So we'll cut back in. We can plug everything. Finish out the episode. Just holler. All right.
All right. Sounds good.
All right. Cool, man. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you. Bye.
I can't believe that happened. I also can't believe that's the first time that's happened.
Yeah, I wonder. Hopefully everything's okay. And
do you know? I mean, like I think
curiosity is definitely kind of striking me right now. But yeah, hopefully everything's cool. Well, let me hold on. Let me stop.
Hit recording.
Let me stop recording. Yeah.
No, I was like, oh man, yeah, that was good.
So yeah, we just got interrupted there by the feds. So yeah,
I will be posting that video to Twitter.
Yeah. So we'll have some cool shit there. Hopefully, the last time our podcast gets interrupted by the feds.
At least they knocked. That's always a plus side. Could just heard a fucking explosion in the background.
It would have been more exciting, but I'm glad that didn't happen.
Right.
So.
I'm surprised we haven't been interrupted by the feds more often. But,
So I'm not exactly sure what we were talking about. But I think we were getting close to time anyhow. So we haven't really mentioned much. I mean, we're really bad at introductions on the show. We're just like, hey, here's this guy we're talking to. Let's get into it. And so like it gets to like the end, and we're like, oh yeah, you have a podcast, you do this and that. We never talked about it. So why don't you go ahead and tell the people a little bit about what you do and where they can find you and all that good stuff.
Yeah. So I run a podcast called Unity or Death. It's exactly what it sounds like. Get people from across the political spectrum on there to talk about important things. I'm very proud of the fact that it's kind of different to a lot of podcasts nowadays, to where it's like, let's have like, generic libertarian positions and hang out with my friends and make jokes. I try to make mine very issue focused and like kind of an activist sort of thing. So like, for example, my last guest that I had on was David McBride, who he's a ex-Australian Special Forces soldier who's currently facing practically life in prison for exposing Australian war crimes. So that's on there. And then other than that, I'll have like panels of different political, topics of the day, and have a bunch of different people from the left and right on there and force them to agree with each other for an hour. Like I think the last one I did was I had a communist, a socialist, an agorist, a libertarian, and an ANCAP all on the same show to talk about how Google isn't a private company. And that was really cool. So that's kind of just what I do on there.
That sounds interesting, yeah.
And then other than that, seeming I'm totally unemployable. Literally, I apply to jobs and they say they Google my name and they can't hire me anymore. So the only thing otherwise I do is I make cool like vaporwave T-shirts of anarchy stuff, and that's on a Teespring underneath the Meta Anarchist, and that's pretty much the only two things I do now.
So what, you're like blackballed just from regular employment, like from protests and stuff, or
just because of my politics? Because if you Google my like real legal name, The first two articles come up are a Sky News article about protesting lockdowns, and then a Washington Post article where they doxed me, called and harassed my grandmother, and then claimed that I was part of an organization that is the KKK on steroids. So if you could imagine being like, Tom's auto repair shop, and you going through your applications and you just like copy and paste someone's name into Google, and that's the first thing that comes up, I almost can't blame them for not hiring me, If they're not obligated to look into it any deeper than that because their employer, it's like whatever, but obviously like I'm kind of fucked because of it. So
I'll go with the guy who wasn't accused of being a super Nazi.
Right, yeah. Which is funny too, because I'm like to the left of every Biden voter that exists. So the fact that I get called a Nazi is really fucking hilarious. But I digress.
Yeah, such is the world we live in.
Oh yeah, that's pretty much it. I'm blacklisted from most employment. I'm banned from PayPal. I'm banned from Patreon. I'm banned from Facebook, Instagram, Etsy, Uber Eats, Grubhub. I'm blacklisted off all of that shit. Can't even like making a fake account. It just automatically gets blocked if it's off my phone or from my IP address. So it's fun being like targeted. But I do believe like this isn't happening to like a lot of it is happening to a degree to the Proud Boys, but not to this extent. This isn't happening to other militia groups. This isn't happening to a lot of anti-fascist organizations or anything. The reason why I think it's particularly targeted at me is because of the unity message. I think the government is no more terrified than any other subject than people like coming together and working together, which is why when you see people who tend to get assassinated by the people who just visited me, I wish they wouldn't have caught me up. I'm having one of those moments where you're in the shower and you're like, damn it, I should have said this. But when they asked me, like, do you know any like extremist organizations that are plotting to like do harm to anybody? I should have been like, well, the FBI.
Hold on, let me grab a mirror.
Yeah, CIA, FBI.
But yeah, like you look at people. You look at people like Fred Hampton, like the FBI in the government didn't like Fred Hampton, but the moment they assassinated him is when he talked about like uniting with like white revolutionary movements to fight the government. Then they killed him. Malcolm X, they didn't like him, but the moment he started being like, don't trust white liberals, like unite with like the actual working class, they killed him. So it's like it seems to be the through line through politics is anyone who advocates, like you could advocate for the wildest like separatist shit in the world. And the government is just like, okay. But the moment you're like, hey, can we all get along? They kill you. So I think that's why they've gone so hard after me and done so much to screw my life up is just because of that message of like, hey, maybe all this culture war stuff is bullshit. And maybe the threat actually is the government. And obviously you can point to people like Assange too. Like Assange was explicitly post-political. He even had one of his famous quotes was, all of our ideologies are based off of lies because nobody knows the truth because the government censors everything. Like, that's a very post-political kind of viewpoint. And you're seeing what they're doing to Assange. So that's kind of my theory of why me, who has like no extreme criminal record, has never hurt anybody, explicitly denounces like offensive acts of violence and everything, gets targeted so heavily by the FBI.
Yeah, that's. I don't envy being that. I don't envy you being so high profile and targeted like that, man. That's unfortunate, man, for sure.
It's definitely not fun.
But it's.
Well, come right for me, man. Come right for me, bro. I've got a spot. I've got a spot for you. I've got a spot for you.
I love it.
Yeah, let's see. Like we've got some people who are relatively canceled. Let's see. We've got we've got a drug war refugee. That's pretty intense. But yeah, having somebody that actively fucked with by the feds would be pretty cool.
Yeah, a lot of people don't know about this, but if you go to medium.com and you look up the most dangerous people in 2020, you have a picture of Donald Trump. There's an article will pop up. You have a picture of Donald Trump, Mark Zuckerberg, I think the chair of the Federal Reserve, and then me in this article. So it's like
Jesus.
So, and I was saying, like, I think what that one conservative lady, I forget her name. It's not Cassandra Fairbanks. It's the other one that like jumped the fence at somebody's house or whatever. You have her, and then you have Donald Trump, and then maybe a couple other people I think are the only people that have been canceled as hard as I have for like nothing. So
Jesus. Fuck. Oh, dude, this has been fucking great, man. You're a blast to talk to, man.
I love
I wish
talking
you
to
lived
people.
closer so we could get a fucking beer.
Right.
Was there anything else, Brandon? I think we pretty much hit everything on my list. But I want to get you on again because 'cause this was a blast.
Heck yeah, I would love to anytime. And like I said, you guys are always welcome on my show if I ever do like another like little Unity panel or something like that.
Let's know.
It's kind of slowing down right now just because I'm dealing with so much crap with like employment and the fallout from the big anti-war march I did in DC, then like everything going on. But I definitely plan on kind of refocusing on it soon. So yeah.
Cool. Yeah, bro. Yeah, invite me anytime you want. And I actually do want to get you writing for the Nexus if you've got some gore stuff or anything related to it. We I do pay the writers. So but we'll talk more after the show for sure. And did you have a quote? I'm looking for a cool what's her name?
I've got a voluntary I'm so bad at talking.
Voltaire declare.
I've got one of her quotes pulled up if you want me to go with that one.
Yeah, hell yeah.
Okay.
My favorite quote from her is
if you have a favorite, you go right ahead.
Yeah, I actually can pull it up right now, and so I don't screw it up, and I can actually read it verbatim.
She's got some good ones, man.
She's great. Like I said, a lot of people sleep on her, and I think it's because she's like against the infighting shit, and everybody's just attracted to that, whether they realize it or not. But right here, so this was a quote of her essentially saying that the American school system was doomed in like the late 1800s, and that everyone was propagandized all the way back then. But she's talking about how Americans at that time viewed the revolution, and I love it to where the quote is, "They have no idea why it should have been called a revolution instead of the English Civil War or any similar title. It's the name of it, that is all. And name worship, both in children and men, has acquired such mastery of them, that the name of the American Revolution is held sacred, though it means to them nothing more than a successful force, while the name revolution, applied to a further possibility, is a specter detested and abhorred." And that's it's so true to me because like the quote before that, because it's a longer quote, but that's the gist of it. She goes on of like, we can name the battles and like George Washington and every single point of the conflict, and like the prisoners of war and what happened when and kind of all the politics behind it. But that's all the English Civil War. We're no longer taught about like the American Revolution. So
it's something that's like I'm so sorry, I forgot my point. Where like when we're taught history, the only thing you're ever taught, especially in government schools, is government actions. Those are the only historical events that are ever significant, is a government action, a war, a battle, or whatever. So I feel like we really don't learn history at all. So I don't know if that's parallel or not to that quote.
Yeah, absolutely.
But I feel it.
Absolutely.
So,
or a government bill or something. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, exactly. If it's not a government action, you don't learn actually about like, cultures or what have you. That's not what history is. So
yeah, absolutely.
Cool.
With that said, Agorist Nexus out.
Peace.
Peace.